The morning they came to collect Alice Slater like a parcel left on a doorstep. The sun was already burning white and merciless over the red dust plains of New Mexico territory, and she stood in the doorway of her father's ranch house with her chin raised so high it ached. It was the summer of 1878, a year when the land itself seemed caught between worlds, when the last of the old Apache raiding trails still cut through the Mesa country, when cattlemen and homesteaders drew property lines in the dirt with the tips of their boots, when the United States government was drafting and redrafting agreements that nobody seemed to keep for very long. Alice had grown up in this land, had learned its moods the way she learned the moods of her father, Elias Slater, in careful silence, watching, waiting, never letting on how much she understood. She was 22 years old, dark-haired and steady-eyed, with the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for submission. They were always wrong about that. The man who rode in ahead of the small party that morning was a lawyer named Hector Pemberton, a pale, damp-collared figure from Santa Fe who carried a leather satchel and spoke in the tone of someone who had rehearsed his words so many times he had stopped hearing them. Behind him rode two men Alice did not recognize, and behind them, on a tall red roan that moved like water over stone, rode Nathan Brenner. Alice noticed him the way you notice a storm on the horizon, not with alarm, not yet, but with the full attention of someone who has learned that weather in this country can change everything in the space of a single afternoon. Nathan Brenner was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of face that had been arranged by years of outdoor work into something that was not quite handsome in the easy way of the men in the illustrated newspapers, but was deeply, unsettlingly interesting to look at. He had light brown eyes that caught the sun oddly, almost gold, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man who had grown up before he meant to. He wore a plain gray coat, no silver trim, no decorative anything, just clean, worn clothing and a single Colt revolver at his hip that he did not touch or gesture toward, which in Alice's experience was actually more threatening than the men who kept reaching for theirs. She stepped back from the doorway as her father came up behind her, laying a hand briefly on her shoulder before moving past her to greet the visitors. Elias Slater was a big man going gray at the temples, a rancher who had built everything he owned from nothing, and who had made the single most catastrophic mistake of his life approximately 6 months ago, when he had borrowed a very large sum of money from a very wrong man. That man was Nathan Brenner's uncle, Clarence Brenner, who held the paper on the Slater ranch, and had recently made it known that he intended to call in the debt unless some other arrangement could be reached. Hector Pemberton climbed down from his horse, adjusted his collar, opened his satchel, and explained the arrangement. Alice listened from the porch. The arrangement was this. In exchange for the forgiveness of the debt and the continued ownership of the Slater ranch, Alice Slater would marry Nathan Brenner. The marriage would be formalized within 30 days. The paperwork, Pemberton explained with the cheerful efficiency of a man who truly did not care about any of this, was already drawn up. It needed only signatures. Elias Slater did not look at his daughter. That was the part that broke something small and specific inside Alice's chest. Not the proposition itself, which was grotesque enough, but the fact that her father did not turn around. He stood on the dirt in front of his ranch house and discussed the terms of his daughter's life as though she were a piece of additional property, and he did not look at her once. Nathan Brenner did. He had dismounted quietly while Pemberton was talking, and he stood now at a slight distance from the group, his hat in his hands, and he was watching Alice with an expression she could not immediately identify. It was not the look of a man who was pleased with himself. It was not triumphant or greedy or even particularly comfortable. If anything, he looked like a man who had walked into a room and found something he had not expected and was now carefully deciding what to do about it. Alice held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back inside the house. She heard the papers being signed through the open window. She did not cry. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed slowly, and she thought very hard, with the complete focused clarity she had learned as a girl, about what exactly her options were. By the time the visitors had gone and her father came inside with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, Alice had made a private decision of her own, separate from all the paperwork and all the arrangements. She would not make this easy. She would not pretend. She would not become a convenient solution to a problem she had not created. Whatever Nathan Brenner thought he was getting, it was not going to be that. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange, suspended state, neither fully present nor resolved. Nathan Brenner did not come to the ranch himself during this time. He sent no letters, no representatives, no polite inquiries about her preferences or her health. Alice found herself simultaneously relieved and, in a way, she was deeply annoyed at herself for, slightly curious. Most men in his position would have shown up to make some performance of kindness, to soften the edges of what was essentially a transaction. The fact that he did not puzzled her. She asked her father once, carefully, what he knew of Nathan Brenner specifically, beyond the fact that he was Clarence's nephew. Elias looked at his boots. He said Nathan ran a cattle operation about 40 miles northeast, near the town of Redemption, which was a real place with an unfortunately ironic name for the current circumstances. He said Nathan was nothing like his uncle in temperament. He said he had heard Nathan was a fair man. Alice said quietly that she was glad her father found that comforting. Elias Slater flinched. He said he was sorry. He said it the way men say things when they have already done them, when sorry is a word that sits beside the damage rather than removing it. Alice nodded once and went back to her work. She was in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon, working through a knot in the lead rope of the gray mare she had ridden since she was 14, when she heard a horse in the yard. She came out into the slant of afternoon light with rope still in her hands, and found Nathan Brenner standing at the gate with his hat off, and a look on his face like a man about to say something that required most of his courage. He looked different without the small crowd of legal proceedings around him. Larger somehow and more uncertain, the golden eyes were the same. "Miss Slater," he said. "Mr. Brenner," she said. There was a pause that had weather in it. "I'd like to talk to you," he said, "if you're willing." "I do not appear to have a great deal of choice about most things at present," Alice said pleasantly. "But yes, go ahead." He seemed to absorb this without flinching, which she noted. Lesser men would have bristled. He simply nodded as if she had made a fair point. "I want you to know," he said slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has thought about exactly these words, "that this arrangement was not my idea." "I gathered that from your expression when Pemberton was explaining it," Alice said. He blinked. "You were watching that closely." "I watch everything closely, Mr. Brenner. It is a habit I developed young." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My uncle holds the paper on your father's ranch. He told me that the debt would be called in within 60 days, and your family would lose everything unless a marriage could be arranged. He presented it as a solution that benefited everyone." "Did he present it that way to you?" Alice asked. "Or did he present it to my father?" Another pause. "Both," Nathan said. "And you agreed?" "I agreed to come and meet you," he said carefully. "I agreed to consider it. I have not yet decided anything." This surprised her enough that she stopped turning the rope in her hands. She looked at him more directly. "The papers were signed," she said. "The papers were signed by your father and my uncle's lawyer," Nathan said. "I have not signed anything." This was new information. Alice filed it away with the particular neatness she applied to things she needed to think about later. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Because I thought you deserved to hear that directly," he said. "And because—" he stopped, started again. "Because I did not think it was right for you to spend 3 weeks believing you had no say in this." Alice looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was golden and the dry smell of the range came off the air in waves, and somewhere in the far pasture one of the horses was calling. "That is," she said finally, "an unusual thing for a man in your position to say." "I am aware," Nathan said quietly. What position does it leave you in, she asked. With your uncle. His jaw tightened briefly. That is my concern to manage. And the ranch, she pressed. My father's debt. That is something I intend to address, he said, separately from any arrangement involving you. Alice Slater had spent 22 years learning to read the difference between what men said and what they meant, and in that moment, standing in the dusty afternoon light with rope in her hands and nothing resolved and nothing certain, she made a preliminary assessment of Nathan Brenner that she kept entirely to herself. She said, "You had better come inside and have some water, Mr. Brenner. The sun is getting past polite." He came in. They sat at the kitchen table where 2 days ago Alice had pressed her hands against the wood and decided not to fold. Her father was out in the east pasture, which she was privately grateful for. She poured water from the clay pitcher and put a cup in front of Nathan and did not bother performing hospitality beyond that. He drank the water. He did not make small talk about the weather or the land or the quality of the range. He said, "Tell me what you want." Alice set her cup down. "I beg your pardon. Tell me what you actually want," he said. "Not what the arrangement says, not what your father needs, what you want." Nobody had asked her that in such a long time that the question felt strange in the air, like a word in a language she had not spoken since childhood. She said, "I want to stay on this land." "All right," he said. "I want my father's debt cleared without any conditions attached to me." "I understand that," he said. "And I want," she said very quietly, "to never again be arranged by anyone for any reason." Nathan Brenner looked at her across the kitchen table, and his expression was complicated in a way she could not entirely parse, something that looked like recognition and something that looked like the beginning of a decision. "I can promise you the first two," he said. "The third is yours to hold on to." "Nobody is going to take it." Alice said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You should know that I do not trust easily." "I am not asking you to trust me," he said. "I am asking you to know your own situation accurately. And my accurate situation is that you have more choices than you have been told," he said. She watched him stand and put his hat back on and thank her for the water. She watched him walk out into the afternoon where his red roan was still standing patient and quiet at the fence. She watched him ride out along the ridge line until the dust settled and the silence came back. She poured herself another cup of water and sat back down and thought for a very long time. Nathan Brenner rode back to his ranch outside Redemption, with the weight of two separate problems settling onto his shoulders, neither of them comfortable. The first was his uncle. The second was everything else. Clarence Brenner was not a cruel man in the obvious, theatrical way of the villains in the dime novels that circulated through the frontier towns. He was something more commonplace and more dangerous than that. He was a practical man, a business-minded man, a man who had never once in his life done anything that he could not justify to himself with arithmetic. He had loaned Elias Slater money at an interest rate that guaranteed difficulty. He had then arranged a solution to that difficulty that cost him nothing and gained him a consolidated holding in the region, because a nephew's wife's father's land was still, in the practical management of frontier properties, connected land. Nathan had understood this clearly from the beginning. What he had not expected was Alice Slater. He had expected fear or resignation or the particular kind of brittle compliance that women in desperate situations sometimes wore like armor. He had not expected a woman who stood in the afternoon sun with rope in her hands and held his gaze without flinching and said things that were entirely true and entirely precise, with the calm efficiency of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time. He had not expected to find himself driving back through the red dust evening, thinking about the exact quality of her eyes when she said she wanted to stay on this land, not sad, not pleading, just certain, the way a statement of fundamental fact is certain. He spent 2 days in Redemption, handling the ordinary work of his cattle operation, which was a real and functioning business that he had built himself, separate from his uncle's various financial interests. He employed 11 men. He ran approximately 800 head of cattle on the range east of the Sanger del Norte Creek. He had a farmhouse that was solid if not beautiful, and a barn that was better than the house, and a long, low bunkhouse where his hands lived, and a reputation in the region as a man who paid his debts and kept his word. On the third day, he rode into Santa Fe to see his uncle. Clarence Brenner kept an office above the main street of Santa Fe, a well-appointed space with leather chairs and framed maps that gave the impression of surveying the territory. He was a broad-shouldered man of 55 who moved slowly and spoke quietly, and was never surprised by anything because he arranged for things to happen before they could surprise him. Nathan sat across the desk from his uncle and said, "I am not going to marry Alice Slater." Clarence looked at him with the expression of a man watching a predictable chess piece make a predictable move. "The arrangement is set," Clarence said. "The arrangement was set without my knowledge and without her consent," Nathan said. "I did not sign the papers. Pemberton has your proxy." "Pemberton does not have my proxy," Nathan said. "Pemberton told you he had my proxy and you chose to believe him because it was convenient. I never gave it." Clarence was quiet for a moment, adjusting the position of the pen on his desk with 2 fingers. This was his tell. Nathan had known since boyhood the small gesture of arrangement when something had disrupted the arrangement in his mind. "The debt stands," Clarence said. "Yes," Nathan agreed. "The debt stands. I want to buy it from you." A pause. "You want to buy Slater's debt. I want to purchase the note from you at face value, and I will then restructure it with Slater on terms that are manageable. Fair terms, nothing else attached. And the girl—" "There is no arrangement involving the girl," Nathan said, with the kind of finality he had been practicing since he was 20 years old and learning how to hold ground with his uncle. "She is not part of this." Clarence studied him for a long moment. He had the look of a man who was calculating not just the arithmetic of the current proposition, but the downstream implications of it. Who would know what, how it would reflect, what leverage was lost. He was always calculating leverage. "This is going to cost you considerably," Clarence said finally. "I am aware of what it costs," Nathan said. "You are doing this for a woman you have met once." Nathan did not answer that directly. He said, "I am doing this because it is the right thing to do and because I want no part in what you arranged. Those are my reasons. Are you willing to sell the note or not?" Clarence sold the note. He was, above all else, a practical man, and the money was real and the leverage over Nathan was, he clearly calculated, more useful than the leverage over a middling ranch in the Mesa country. He signed the papers with the same 2-finger pen arrangement, and handed them across the desk with a look that said this conversation was not fully over, which Nathan acknowledged without responding to. He rode back through the long, empty miles between Santa Fe and the Mesa country with the note in his satchel, and the beginning of something forming in his chest that he was not entirely sure what to do with. Alice Slater was not expecting anyone when Nathan Brenner rode into the yard for the second time, and she was considerably less composed than during the first visit, being in the middle of mending a fence post with a hammer and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair not entirely cooperative in the afternoon heat. She saw him coming from the rise and she had just enough time to roll her sleeves back down before he reached the gate. He dismounted. He handed her the note. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked back at the note. "This is my father's debt," she said. "It was your father's debt to my uncle," Nathan said. "I bought it from him this morning." "You bought it?" "At face value," he said. "And I am giving it to you. The note, the record of it, everything. There are no conditions. It is simply gone. Tell your father the debt is cleared." Alice stared at the paper in her hands. She had a very strong feeling that if she spoke immediately she would not be able to govern what came out, so she did not speak for a moment. She looked at the cramped legal handwriting, the figures, the dates, her father's signature at the bottom of the page. "Why?" she said. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "That is not a complete answer," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon heat was significant and the cicadas were doing their enormous work in the grass beyond the fence. He looked at her with those odd golden eyes and said, "Because no one should be bartered. Not for land, not for debt, not for any other reason. And because what my uncle did was not right and I will not benefit from it." Alice held the paper. She thought about her father not looking at her. She thought about standing at the gate 3 weeks ago with her chin raised so the ache in it was the only thing she was feeling. She said, "What about the arrangement? Pemberton's papers?" Nathan reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it up. Then, without any ceremony at all, he produced a match from his vest pocket, struck it on the fence post beside him, and held the flame to the corner of the paper. Alice watched the document catch and curl and blacken. Nathan held it until the flame reached his fingers, then dropped the last corner in the dirt and pressed it out with his boot. "There is no arrangement," he said. "There never should have been." The thing that was aching in Alice's chest, not grief, not the old familiar weight of being arranged and decided about, was something sharper and newer and considerably more inconvenient. She recognized it with the same analytical clarity she applied to everything, and she did not particularly welcome it, but she was honest enough not to pretend it was not there. She said, "You should know that burning a legal document does not void it under territorial law." The corner of his mouth moved. It was almost a smile. "I have a lawyer in Santa Fe who will tell you that the document in question was never validly executed in the first place, given the absence of my signature," he said. "The burning was for the principle of the thing." "The principle of the thing," she repeated. "I thought it deserved to be burned," he said simply. Alice looked at him for a long moment with the afternoon sun on everything and the charred corner of the paper still smoking faintly in the dirt between them, and she said, "Have supper, Mr. Brenner. My father will want to thank you." He stayed for supper. Elias Slater, when presented with the cleared note and the explanation of what Nathan had done, went through several visible emotions in rapid succession: shock, relief, a complicated shame that had no clean resolution, and finally a shaky genuine gratitude that he extended across the table with a hand that trembled slightly. Nathan accepted it without making anything large of it, which Alice watched carefully. Over the meal they talked about cattle and weather and the condition of the ranges after a dry spring, and Nathan asked her father about the gray mare she had been working with, and Elias said Alice knew horses better than anyone in the county, which he said with a sudden look at his daughter that was almost, finally, something like pride. After supper Nathan helped clear the plates, which was not a thing that was expected of him, and Alice, handing him a stack of them in the kitchen doorway, found herself standing closer to him than she had intended, close enough to notice that he smelled like horses and clean air and something faintly like cedar, and she stepped back and said thank you in a voice that was perhaps less level than usual. He rode out before full dark. He turned once at the top of the rise and lifted a hand, and Alice, standing at the porch, lifted hers in return, and then stood in the blue evening feeling the inconvenience of what was happening to her with considerable seriousness. The weeks that followed were nothing she had planned for. Nathan Brenner did not disappear now that the transaction was complete. He did not send polite notes, which would have been manageable. He came himself, riding the 40 miles between his ranch and her father's with a casualness that she was not fooled by, because nothing about Nathan Brenner was casual. It was all deliberate, only held in a very quiet way. He came to help with a section of broken fence along the eastern pasture, because his foreman had mentioned to her father's hand at the town market that a dry season needed good fencing for the cattle not to drift. He came because there was a cattle buyer out of Albuquerque passing through Redemption, and her father's stock was good enough to warrant a look, and Nathan drove the introduction personally. He came on a Thursday afternoon that had no particular justification attached to it, and when Alice, who was mending in the front room, heard his horse in the yard and went to the window and then deliberately did not go to the door, he knocked and said through it, "I brought something for the gray mare, if that is all right." and she opened the door because that was an honest reason. What he had brought was a better quality of lead rope than the one she had been working with, braided leather, soft-handled, the kind that took the chafe out of training work. It was a practical gift, completely without romance, and it was absolutely perfect. She said thank you. He said she was welcome. They stood in the yard with the mare between them, and Nathan said, "She is green-broke still." And Alice said, "She is green-broke, but she has sense. The problem is she was started too hard." And they spent the better part of an hour working with the mare in the round pen, and talking about horses with the ease of two people who have both spent considerable time being honestly interested in the same thing. And when the sun was getting long and Alice looked up from where she was standing with the mare's lead in her hands, and saw Nathan on the fence rail watching her, with an expression that she now recognized as the one he wore when he was feeling something and not yet decided whether to say it, she felt a warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. They fell into something in those weeks that had no formal name yet. He came, and she did not send him away. She asked him things because she was genuinely curious about him, not because she was performing interest, and he answered with the same careful honesty he seemed to apply to everything. She learned that he had come to New Mexico territory at 19 from Missouri, with 4 horses and enough money for a year, and had built the cattle operation himself through work and a few fortunate decisions. She learned that his mother had died when he was 12, and his uncle had been the only family left, and that their relationship was therefore complicated in ways he did not entirely want to detail, but that she understood without the details. She learned that he read, which surprised her and then did not, and that he thought the current state of federal land policy in the territories was both unjust and unsustainable, which she agreed with completely. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher when she was young, before it became clear that the ranch needed her. He learned that she had a younger brother named James who had gone to Kansas City 2 years ago and sent irregular letters. He learned that she had opinions about the water rights dispute between the Slater Ranch and the neighboring Coleman property that were more thoroughly informed than most county lawyers could manage, and that she had actually drafted a written argument about it that her father had never submitted because Elias Slater dealt with conflict by ignoring it until it changed shape. One evening they were sitting on the porch as the light failed, each holding a cup of coffee, the conversation having moved through several subjects and arrived at a comfortable silence, when Nathan said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer of no is a complete and permanent answer that I will accept without difficulty." Alice said, "Go ahead." He said, "Would you consider spending some time with me in Redemption? There is a gathering next Saturday, not a grand affair, just the town's summer dance at the livery, the kind of thing that happens every year. I would very much like to take you." Alice set her coffee cup on the rail. She said, "Is this a courtship, Mr. Brenner?" He said, "If you will let it be." She said, "I have a condition." He waited. She said, "It moves at my pace. When I say slow, we go slow. When I say stop, we stop. This is not a revised version of an arrangement. This is entirely mine to decide." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Entirely." She looked out at the dark beyond the porch for a moment. Then she said, "I will go to the dance." The town of Redemption in the summer of 1878 was the kind of frontier settlement that had the bones of permanence without yet being certain of its future, a main street of false-fronted buildings, a real hotel that had opened the previous year, a general store, a livery, a church under construction that had been under construction for 4 years, and approximately 200 residents who had decided to bet on this particular patch of New Mexico territory, becoming something worth staying in. The summer dance was held in the large livery at the edge of town, the main doors thrown open to the evening air, lanterns hung from every beam, a fiddle player and a guitar player, and a man with a squeeze box making music that had no technical sophistication whatsoever and was entirely wonderful. Alice wore the blue dress she had not worn in 2 years, and she put her hair up with the care she gave to things that mattered, And when Nathan came to collect her in the wagon and she came out of the house and he saw her, the expression on his face was not performed. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that is genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful, and he caught himself and looked slightly away and then looked back and said, "You look, that is a fine dress." And Alice thought that the imperfection of the compliment was worth 10 fluent speeches. They drove to Redemption in the summer evening, with the stars beginning to come out and the smell of sage heavy in the air. And they talked about nothing important, and Alice noticed that the nervousness she had expected to feel, the residual defensiveness that had been her constant companion since the day Pemberton rode in with his satchel, was quieter than usual. Not gone, but quieter. She danced twice, which was twice more than she had danced in the past 3 years. The first was with old Hector Beaumont, who was 65 and danced with everyone out of pure social exuberance and meant nothing by it. The second was with Nathan, who asked her with his hat in his hand and a slight formality that she found endearing in the way that real things are endearing, not polished, but genuine. He was a competent dancer in the rough way of men who have not had much occasion to practice, and she was better than him. And when she told him so quietly in the middle of a turn, he laughed, a real laugh. Not a performance of amusement, but an actual sound of pleasure. And it was the first time she had heard him laugh like that, and it did something to her chest that she was going to have to think about seriously later. After the dancing, there was a long evening on the front steps of the livery with cold lemonade from the general store, watching the town life move past in the warm night. Nathan's foreman, a weathered man named Cord Abernathy, stopped to talk cattle for a few minutes. 2 women from the church committee said hello to Alice with the careful warmth of people deciding whether to like her. A boy of about 8 chased a dog through the street and the dog won. On the drive home, Nathan said, "Thank you for coming." Alice said, "Thank you for asking." There was a silence that had something new in it, warmer than the silences before and more aware of itself. She said, "Nathan." It was the first time she had used his given name. She felt him register it, felt the slight alteration in the way he held the reins. "Alice," he said, and the way he said it was not practiced. It was the way you say something when you have been careful not to say it until the right moment, and the moment has arrived. She said, "I think this is working." He said, "I think so too." She said, "I'm still going slowly." He said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to say it out loud because I think it is true and I thought you should know." He looked at her briefly in the dark, the stars over everything, the road pale ahead of them, and he said, "It means a great deal to hear you say it." They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was the best kind. The kind that exists not because there is nothing to say, but because everything that has been said is still in the air, and there is no need to cover it up with more words. At the gate of the Slater ranch, he helped her down from the wagon and held her hand a moment longer than the assistance required, and she let him, and they stood in the yard in the dark with the warm night all around them, and said good night with a careful formality that was entirely transparent to both of them. And he rode away, and Alice went inside and sat at the kitchen table and smiled at the empty room with the full, unself-conscious pleasure of someone who is alone enough to be honest with herself. The autumn came slowly and then all at once, the way seasons do in the Mesa country, and things between Alice and Nathan continued to deepen with the particular unhurried steadiness that characterized everything Nathan did. He did not rush. He did not press. He brought himself consistently and honestly and let her make of it what she would. She made quite a lot of it. They rode together on the long evenings when the light went amber and low across the grass, sometimes talking and sometimes not, learning the shapes of each other's silences. She met Cord Abernathy properly and liked him enormously. A man of few words and large competencies, who managed Nathan's operation with quiet authority, and regarded Alice with the appreciative wariness of someone who has spotted genuine quality. She met Nathan's 2 neighbor ranchers, the Hayward brothers, who were noisy and good-natured, and asked her entirely inappropriate questions about when she and Nathan were getting married, to which she said merely, "I will tell you when I have decided." And both brothers found this answer so satisfactory that they bought her a drink. She visited Nathan's ranch for the first time on a bright October morning when he had asked her honestly if she would like to see it. She walked through the operation with the assessment of a woman who had grown up running a ranch, noting the well-maintained fencing, the quality of the herd, the cleanliness of the barn, the way his hired men worked without being watched. She noted that the house was indeed, as he had told her, solid but not pretty, a practical structure of adobe and timber with good bones, and absolutely no domestic imagination applied to it. She stood in the front room, which had a stone fireplace and a good window facing west and was otherwise entirely empty of anything softening, and she said, "This room wants something." Nathan said, "It has been missing something for quite some time." He said it to the room, not to her, looking at the empty wall above the fireplace, and Alice understood that they were not talking about furniture. She rode home that afternoon with the October light on everything and a very clear sense of what she wanted, and she sat with that clarity for 3 days before she did anything about it. On the 4th day, she rode to Nathan's ranch alone. He was in the barn when she arrived, working over a harness, and he came out into the yard at the sound of her horse with a question on his face that became something else when he saw that she was alone and that she had ridden there herself without occasion or invitation. She dismounted. She stood in the yard with the autumn light coming over the ridge. She said, "I have been thinking." He said, "All right," she said, "about what I want. You asked me that a long time ago on the very first day." "What do I actually want?" He waited. "I want to stay on this land," she said. "I want the ranch. I want horses. I want mornings that are mine and evenings that are full and something to build toward." She paused. "I think I also want to build it with you." Nathan Brenner was very still for a moment in the yard. The October wind moved through the grass. A horse shifted in the barn. Then he said, her name very quietly, "Alice," she said, "I am choosing you. Not because of the debt and not because of arrangements and not because I ran out of other options. Because I have watched you for 4 months and you are honest and steady, and you make me laugh, and you gave me back my choice when you did not have to, and I would like to give it back to you voluntarily. That is entirely different from every other version of this situation, and I wanted you to know I understand the difference." He crossed the yard to her in 4 steps and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was entirely in contradiction to the size and roughness of them, and he looked at her for a moment with those gold-lit eyes before he kissed her, and Alice let herself be kissed in the full willing sense of that present, decided, completely there. It was a good kiss. It was the kind that has the weight of real feeling behind it and does not perform itself, and when it was done, they stood in the yard with their foreheads together and the autumn coming down around them, and Nathan said, very quietly, "I have been hoping for months that you would," she said. "I know." He pulled back to look at her. "You knew? I told you I watch everything closely," she said, and he laughed again, that real laugh, and put his arm around her shoulders and walked her toward the house because there was coffee on the fire and the afternoon was long, and they had a great many things to talk about. There were practical things to attend to, and they attended to them with the same direct honesty they brought to everything else. They talked about where they would live. Alice was clear that she could not leave her father's ranch entirely, not until Elia's was better situated, and Nathan said simply that he could run his operation from either location with regular travel between them, that it was 40 miles of good riding, and he had ridden harder distances for lesser reasons. They talked about the timing of things, which they agreed would be when Alice said it was time and not before. They talked about what a shared life between 2 people who each had strong ideas about most things would actually look like, which was a longer conversation that ended not in resolution, but in the mutual acknowledgement that they were both willing to have it regularly and honestly, which was actually the most important thing. In November, Alice finally wrote to her brother James in Kansas City, and told him what had happened, all of it, from Pemberton's arrangement to the burning of the papers, to the dance at Redemption, to the October afternoon in the yard. She wrote it the way she thought about things, precisely and without excessive emotion, and she ended the letter by saying that she thought she was going to be happy, which she had not expected to write and which, once written, she found she believed completely. James wrote back within 2 weeks, which was faster than he had ever responded to a letter in his life, and said among other things that if Nathan Brenner ever gave her cause for unhappiness, James would come back from Kansas City to address the matter personally, which Alice found both touching and slightly absurd, and she read the relevant passage aloud to Nathan, who said he thought James sounded like a man of good character, and he looked forward to meeting him. The winter of 1878 into 1879 passed with a particular tenderness. Nathan spent more time at the Slater ranch, helping with the cold weather work, becoming known to the rhythms of the place. The old dog who slept by the fire, the sound the north wind made against the shutters, the way Elias Slater was more at ease with himself as the weeks passed, and the weight of the old debt finished lifting off him. Elias, for his part, was doing a quiet but genuine act of repair in his relationship with his daughter, the kind that has no dramatic moment but consists entirely of small consecutive acknowledgments asking her opinion about ranch decisions and then acting on it, saying thank you for meals that he had previously eaten without comment, and once, on a cold evening when it was just the two of them at the table, saying, "I know I failed you, Alice. I am trying to do better than that." Alice said, "I know you are, Dad." It was not a full absolution, and both of them understood that, but it was real, and real things are what repair is made of. On a clear January afternoon, Nathan came to the Slater ranch with a small box in his coat pocket and found Alice at the fence with the gray mare, who had come along beautifully with the new lead rope and the patient work. He leaned on the fence and watched her work for a while, and then said her name, and she turned with the mare standing quiet beside her, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. He said, "I have a question that I want to ask you, and I want to be clear before I ask it that it is entirely a question. The answer is yours," she said. "Ask." He said, "Will you marry me? Not to settle anything, not to arrange anything, not for land or debt or any practical reason. Because I love you, and I want to build a life with you, and every day I spend in your company is better than every day I spend without it." Alice stood with the gray mare's lead in her hand, and the January sky enormous above the mesa country, and the man in front of her with his hat in his hand and his honest eyes and the box in his palm that he had opened to show her a simple ring, gold with a small garnet that caught even the pale winter light. She said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she pressed her palm flat against his chest for a moment, feeling his heart moving fast under the coat despite the stillness of his face, and she smiled at that. The fact that he was not as composed as he appeared, that he had been nervous, that the certainty of his presentation did not mean the absence of feeling. She liked that enormously. He put his arms around her, and she let herself lean into him, just briefly, with the cold air all around them and the horse standing patient beside them and the long mesa country stretching out in every direction. And it felt exactly like what it was chosen, completely and freely, by both of them. They were married in March of 1879, in the partially constructed church at Redemption that was, for once, finished enough for the occasion, the last planks of the interior only nailed down the week before. It was a Tuesday, because Alice said she would not be married on a weekend when everyone in the county expected it and would fill the event with other people's sentimentality, which made Nathan laugh. The morning was clear and cold, and the hills to the north still had snow on them that caught the light. Elias Slater walked his daughter down the aisle with an arm that shook slightly and eyes that were very bright, and Alice wore a cream-colored dress that she and the wife of the Redemption postmaster had sewn together over the course of 2 winter afternoons, and Nathan stood at the front of the unfinished church in his best coat looking at her with the expression he wore when he was feeling something too large to contain, which she had learned to recognize and which she privately treasured. The reverend who conducted the service was a young man named Thomas Marsh, who had arrived in Redemption the previous fall and took his work seriously. He said the words clearly and without hurry. Nathan spoke his vows in the deliberate way he did everything slowly, making sure each word landed with its full weight. Alice spoke hers looking directly at him, without looking away, because she had spent enough of her life not looking directly at things. Cord Abernathy, standing as Nathan's best man, produced the rings from his vest pocket with the careful dignity of a man who has been entrusted with something important and intends to acquit himself well. The Hayward brothers, seated in the third row, managed to get through the ceremony without making any inappropriate commentary, which Alice had been slightly worried about and Nathan had bet against. When the Reverend said they were married, Nathan kissed her in the plain church in the plain morning in front of the 40-odd people who had come out on a Tuesday in March, and the fiddle player the Hayward brothers had brought without asking struck up something lively from the back of the room before the Reverend had properly finished speaking. And Alice, still in the kiss, felt Nathan's face change with that laugh she had been collecting since the beginning, and she pulled back and laughed herself, and the church was full of it. The gathering afterward at the livery was the best one Redemption had had in years, which the town agreed on unanimously, even accounting for the variety of opinions on most other subjects. The food was good, and the music was louder than necessary, and the Hayward brothers danced with such enthusiasm that one of them knocked over a lantern that was fortunately unlit. Elias Slater had 2 glasses of whiskey and made a speech that was short and heartfelt, and ended with him looking at his daughter and saying simply, "I am proud of you, girl," which Alice received without crying barely. James Slater had come from Kansas City for the wedding, arriving the day before on the stage from Albuquerque, and he and Nathan met for the first time over the dinner table at the Slater ranch the evening before the wedding, and Alice watched them with the analytical interest of someone invested in the outcome. James was 24, dark-haired like his sister, with more of their father's broad build and considerably less of their father's tendency to avoid things. He shook Nathan's hand and looked at him with frank, measuring eyes, and Nathan met the look without deflecting, and they talked about cattle in Kansas City and the water rights situation along the northern ranges. And by the end of the evening James said to Alice privately in the kitchen that Nathan Brenner was, in his considered opinion, exactly what he hoped for his sister. Alice said, "I know," with a composure that James saw straight through, and he put his arm around her shoulders and said nothing more, which was the correct response. After the wedding, Alice moved to Nathan's ranch at Redemption, as they had planned, but maintained a regular presence at her father's operation through the spring planting and the early summer work, riding the 40 miles, as Nathan had said, with a frequency that kept both ranches connected. She and Nathan had a kind of working partnership that was entirely unlike her parents' marriage had been, both of them with opinions and skills, and a willingness to argue when the arguments were necessary, followed by an equal willingness to stop arguing and come to something workable. Nathan's house was no longer empty of domestic imagination. Alice brought with her a rug from the Slater house, old and good, that her mother had brought from Missouri 15 years ago. She put it in the front room in front of the stone fireplace, and the room immediately became something different. Nathan looked at it on the evening she laid it down and said nothing, but the expression on his face made her glad she had brought it. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house in April, which the New Mexico climate was difficult about but not impossible. She had long conversations with Cord Abernathy about the cattle management, and found him a willing collaborator when she had ideas, which was considerably easier than she had expected, because Cord had been quietly hoping for years that the ranch would have someone with fresh eyes. She became, over the course of that first spring and summer, not just the rancher's wife in the background but a working presence in the operation. And the men who worked for Nathan accepted this with varying speeds and universal eventual respect. It was in the June of their first year together that Clarence Brenner rode to redemption. Alice was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse, and she came around the side of the house to find Nathan already in the yard, having apparently heard his uncle coming from some internal alertness that had never fully relaxed in the direction of Clarence. Nathan stood with his arms at his sides and a very still face, and Clarence sat his horse looking down at him. Alice wiped her hands on her apron and walked over and stood beside her husband. Clarence looked at her for a moment with the calculating eyes of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation. He said to Nathan, "I want to discuss the northern grazing rights." Nathan said, "All right." They went inside. Alice made coffee. She sat at the table because this was her house and her table, and she had no intention of retreating from it. And if Clarence Brenner was surprised by this, he managed not to show it. The conversation about the northern grazing rights was exactly what it appeared to be, a legitimate business discussion about shared range boundaries that needed to be clarified as both operations expanded. Nathan handled it with his characteristic steady directness, conceded nothing that needed not to be conceded, and kept the entire interaction on the level of straightforward business, which was apparently the level Clarence was content to operate on when the other options were removed. Before he left, Clarence looked at Alice one more time and said, with the air of a man making a very careful concession, "You are managing the place well." Alice said, "Thank you," with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely did not imply she had forgot anything. After Clarence rode out, Nathan stood at the kitchen window watching the dust settle, and Alice stood beside him with her coffee, and they did not speak for a moment. Nathan said, "He will not cause trouble." Alice said, "I know." He said, "I should have refused him from the beginning. The first time he proposed the arrangement, I should have refused it without going to see you first." Alice said, "If you had refused without coming to see me first, I would not have met you." She set her coffee down and looked at him. "And I would consider that a loss." He turned from the window and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over the past year, the one that appeared when he was feeling something he had not expected. He pulled her close in the way he had with both arms, not a polite embrace but a real one, the kind that means something, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment and let the warmth of it settle through her. "I love you," he said quietly against her hair. "I know that too," she said. Then, "I love you." He held her a little tighter, and she could feel the slow breath go out of him, the kind that means a person is setting something down, and they stood in the kitchen in the June light while the coffee cooled and the ordinary excellent morning went on around them. The summer of 1879 was the fullest Alice had ever known. She learned the particular quality of light at the Redemption Ranch, which was different from her father's land. The hills to the north held it longer, and there was a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that went gold in the afternoon in a way that made her stop sometimes just to see it. She rode every day, and the gray mare had come with her from her father's ranch, and settled into the new place with the philosophical adaptability of a horse who has been well handled. Nathan taught her things she did not know about cattle management, and she taught him things he did not know about horses, and they argued cheerfully about which body of knowledge was more broadly applicable, and neither of them conceded, and it was one of their better ongoing conversations. Cord Abernathy's wife, a compact and efficient woman named Marta who had been living in Redemption while Cord lived at the ranch, began coming out more frequently once Alice was there, because Alice was someone Marta could talk to, and the two women became friends with the practical warmth of people who have both been largely on their own and know what the genuine article looks like when they find it. They worked the garden together and swapped knowledge about canning and winter supplies, and Marta said once, without ceremony, "You are good for this place." And good for him, with a nod toward wherever Nathan was working, and Alice felt this in the way you feel things that are exactly true. In August, Alice realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Nathan, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted the 3 days to be entirely hers, the private, enormous certainty of it, the way it changed the dimensions of every room she stood in. On the 4th day she told him in the evening on the porch, sitting in the chairs they had put there in May, the summer stars beginning over the ridge. Nathan went very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open, lit, entirely without calculation. He said, "Alice," she said, "I know." He reached across and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat in the evening looking at the stars that had always been there and that looked, tonight, considerably more like something. She said, "Are you happy?" he said. "I am more happy than I have ever been in my life. I want to say something eloquent about it, but I cannot find words that are large enough." She said, "Then do not use words." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it with a gentleness that was completely in earnest. And Alice looked at the stars and felt, deep and sure and chosen, exactly what it was she was feeling, which was happiness of the specific kind that has been worked for and decided upon freely, which is the best kind there is. James came back from Kansas City in September, this time for a longer stay, having decided that Kansas City had given him most of what it had to give, and the Mesa country might have more to offer than he had previously given it credit for. He spent a month at their father's ranch, and then 2 weeks at Redemption, and he and Nathan settled into the easy camaraderie of men who respect each other's competencies and share a mutual investment in the same person's well-being. James had brought with him, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a young woman named Clara Holt whom he had met in Kansas City, a quiet and intelligent schoolteacher who looked at the landscape of New Mexico territory with the combined expression of someone who is slightly alarmed and someone who is falling in love with a place, which Alice recognized immediately and considered very promising. Clara stayed. James stayed with her, more or less. Elias Slater, by the following spring, had a schoolteacher daughter-in-law helping him manage the ranch house in a way that was both more organized and considerably more pleasant than it had been in years. And James had taken on a real investment in the Slater cattle operation that lifted the last of the weight from Elias' shoulders. The water rights dispute with the Coleman property, which had been simmering without resolution for 3 years, came to a head in the early spring of 1880 when Sam Coleman dug a diversion channel that reduced the Slater Creek flow by a measurable amount. Alice, who had written the original legal argument, sat down and wrote a much more pointed version of it with Nathan, who contributed his knowledge of territorial water law from a lawsuit he had watched his neighbor Hayward go through the previous year. They submitted it to the county land office in Santa Fe with considerably more documentation than Sam Coleman had apparently expected, and the office ruled in favor of the Slater Ranch inside of 6 weeks, which was fast for the territorial land system, and which Nathan said was the result of the argument being simply too well documented to dismiss. Alice allowed herself one moment of private satisfaction about this, and then went back to preparing for the baby. The baby arrived in the early morning of April 14, 1880, after a labor that was long and hard, and which Alice endured with the same focused, steady quality she brought to everything difficult. Nathan was downstairs in the house for most of it, moving between the front room and the kitchen, with the barely managed composure of a man who is very good at being steady, and who is finding the limits of that particular capacity. Marta Abernathy was present, having arrived the day before on the natural instinct of a good friend, and she assisted the doctor from Redemption with the calm efficiency of a woman who has seen most things. When the doctor came downstairs and said, "A boy, Mr. Brenner, healthy and loud," Nathan stood very still for a moment and then said, "Alice." "She is well," the doctor said. "She is very well. She is asking for you." Nathan went upstairs. Alice was sitting propped against the pillows in the pale morning light, holding a bundle that was small and red-faced and spectacularly unhappy about the morning, making this known to the room in clear and vigorous terms. She looked up when Nathan came in, and her face was exhausted and entirely bright at the same time, the particular brightness of someone who has done something enormous and knows it. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and he did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Alice said, "He has your eyes already. Already impossible." Nathan said, very quietly, "He has your stubbornness. Look at that expression." She laughed, tired and real, and held the baby out. And Nathan took him with the careful terror of a man holding something that matters more than he knew anything could, settling his son against his chest with both arms, looking down at the new small face with gold-lit eyes that were full of everything. They named him Henry James Brenner, Henry for no one in particular and James for Alice's brother, who arrived at redemption 2 days later in a state of delighted unclehood that was extremely loud and extremely sincere, and who held his nephew with an ease that suggested he had been practicing, possibly on imaginary babies in Kansas City. Clara came with James, and she and Alice sat together in the front room with the rug from Missouri on the floor and the spring light coming through the window, and Clara said that she and James were going to be married in June, quietly at the Slater ranch, and Alice put her hand over Clara's and said she was very glad and meant it completely. The spring of 1880 was the best one on record in the territory, the ranges green and wide, the cattle fat and healthy, the creeks running full. Nathan and Alice rode out together on the first genuinely warm April morning. Henry left temporarily in the capable hands of Marta Abernathy, and they rode the full width of the Redemption Range from the eastern fence to the Cottonwood Creek in the afternoon light. And it was the ride Alice had been wanting since the cold winter had kept her largely indoors, and it was even better than she had been anticipating. They stopped at the creek and let the horses drink, and stood side by side in the tall grass, with the water running clear over the stones and the cottonwood trees budding green above them, and the whole enormous sky of New Mexico territory laid out in every direction. Nathan said, "I keep thinking about that day in your father's yard, the first time I came." Alice said, "I keep thinking about the day you burned the papers." He said, "You were very composed." She said, "I was almost entirely not composed. I was extremely composed on the outside, which is different." He looked at her sideways. "I know," he said. "I could tell." She looked at him. "You could not tell." "I could tell because your hand stopped moving," he said. "You had been turning that rope over and over, and when I struck the match, your hand stopped." Alice considered this. "You noticed that." "I notice everything about you," he said simply. "I have since that first afternoon." She took his hand and they stood by the creek in the spring light, and Alice thought about the morning a year and a half ago when a lawyer with a satchel had ridden into the yard, and she had pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table and decided not to fold. She thought about the document burning in the dirt. She thought about the dance, and the kitchen table, and the gray mare, and the January yard, and the unfinished church, and the morning Henry arrived, and all the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of things that had been built since then. She thought about choosing, the specific, clear-eyed, voluntary act of it. She was glad she had waited until the choice was real. She was glad Nathan had made it real. She was glad for all of it, not in the easy way of someone who has forgotten the difficulty, but in the full way of someone who has walked through the difficult parts and come to something true on the other side. She said, "Nathan." He said, "Alice." She said, "I chose well." He brought their joined hands up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the way he had the night on the porch when he told her he was happy, and said, "So did I extraordinarily well." The horses finished drinking and pulled back toward the grass. The creek ran on over the pale stones. The cottonwoods made their green sound in the light wind. And Alice Slater, who was Alice Brenner now and had chosen to be, stood in the spring afternoon on the land she loved with the man she had freely, completely, and correctly chosen, and was happy, the full, deep, unglamorous, absolutely real kind of happy that comes to people who have decided what they want and then gone toward it without looking away. Nathan and Alice rode back to the ranch house in the golden late afternoon, horses moving easy, neither of them in any hurry. Cord Abernathy was fixing a section of the barn roof as they came in, and called down something about a loose cow in the north pasture that Nathan said he would address in the morning, and Cord said that would do fine. And this exchange, which was entirely about livestock management and contained no romance whatsoever, was somehow exactly perfect, the ordinary life that made up the real shape of what had been built. Marta met them at the door with Henry, who had spent the afternoon being charming and was now expressing his opinions about the quality of the early evening with considerable volume. Alice took him, and he quieted immediately with the particular efficiency of babies who know exactly whose arms they prefer. And Nathan looked at this and looked at Alice, and his expression was the same one he had worn the morning Henry arrived, open and lit, nothing held back. They had supper in the kitchen, the four of them, Nathan and Alice and Cord and Marta, with Henry asleep in the cradle that Nathan had made over the winter out of cedar from the creek, and the conversation moved through the ordinary subjects of ranch life and was entirely pleasant. And after supper, Nathan poured a small amount of whiskey and Marta had tea, and they sat in the front room on the rug from Missouri, and the fire was going, and the night was cool outside and entirely quiet. This was the life. Not the dancing, not the dramatic moments, though Alice kept those too, the burning paper, the January yard, the morning in the church. But this. The fire and the voices and the ordinary good weight of having exactly what you wanted. In June, James and Clara were married at the Slater ranch as planned, a small ceremony under the big sky with Elias Slater standing straighter than he had in years, and Alice stood with Henry on her hip and watched her brother marry a good woman in the country that had raised them. And it was the best kind of June morning, warm and dry and full of things that were right. Nathan stood beside her, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he leaned back. And they watched James and Clara, and the sun came over the ridge, and the light was on everything. Over the next years, the Brenner operation grew steadily, not through the kind of aggressive expansion that consumed some frontier ranchers and turned them into the thing they had originally fought against, but through the careful, thoughtful building of something sustainable. Nathan bought the additional acreage to the north when it became available in 1881, expanding the range in a way that made the existing operation healthier rather than just larger. Alice continued her involvement in the management and expanded the horse operation specifically, beginning to breed the gray mare's offspring with a quality stallion from the Hayward brothers' herd, developing a line of working horses that had a reputation in the region for being exactly what Alice Slater had always valued: smart, patient, and honestly trained. Henry grew from a red-faced infant into a decisive, golden-eyed boy with his mother's intensity and his father's stillness, a combination that made him, at age 4, the most competent child at sitting quietly through long adult conversations and then repeating the most important parts of them at dinner. Nathan said that was entirely his mother's doing. Alice said it was entirely his father's. In the spring of 1882, Alice told Nathan that Henry was going to have a brother or a sister. They were in the barn this time because that was where Alice happened to be, and there was nothing ceremonial about the moment. She was sorting tack and Nathan was replacing a saddle tree, and she looked at him across the saddle stand and said, "We are going to have another one." And Nathan set down the saddle tree and looked at her with the same face he had made the first time, open, unguarded, entirely glad. He came around the saddle and she met him halfway and he held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and Henry, who had been sitting in the corner pulling very methodically at a loose piece of straw, looked up and said, "What is happening?" with the particular directness of a 3-year-old who has been watching adults carefully and is beginning to have opinions about the things they do not explain. Nathan said, "Something very good, Henry." Henry considered this and went back to the straw, which was apparently sufficient. Their second child arrived in November of 1882, a boy they named Thomas, after the reverend who had married them and who had by now baptized half of Redemption. Thomas arrived faster and louder than Henry had, making his temperament immediately apparent, and where Henry had been contemplative from the start, Thomas was in motion before he was properly finished arriving, reaching for everything within reach and several things that were not. Nathan held both of his sons in the November kitchen, one on each arm, while Alice rested upstairs, and he looked at them with an expression that Marta Abernathy, who was present, described later to her husband Cord as the look of a man who cannot believe what his life has become, in the very best sense. The years that followed were full in the real sense, the kind that is not even and not without difficulty, but that has something solid in the middle of it that holds. There were hard winters and a terrible dry summer in 1883 that took a fifth of the herd and required a year of careful rebuilding. There was a dispute with a new settler to the east who did not understand range rights and who required patient, extended negotiation. There was a year when Elias Slater's health declined, and Alice spent more time at her father's ranch, and Nathan drove that 40 miles twice a week without complaint, and Elias died quietly in the winter of 1884 with his daughter holding his hand, and the last of the old difficulty between them genuinely resolved. Alice grieved her father with the same direct clarity she brought to everything, not denying it, not hurrying through it, letting it take the time it required. Nathan let her grieve in her own shape, staying present without pressing, which was exactly what she needed and which she told him so clearly, because that was how they had always done things. The Slater ranch passed to James, who had been running it effectively for years, and James and Clara, who now had 2 children of their own, settled permanently into the Mesa country with the contentment of people who have found the right place. The Slater and Brenner families became the kind of extended network that the frontier country produced at its best. Not a dynasty or an empire, but simply a group of people who loved each other and showed up for each other across the 40 miles of good riding and helped each other through the difficult parts. By the time Henry Brenner was 7 and Thomas was 4, the ranch at Redemption had become something Alice was proud of with the clean pride of actual accomplishment, horses and cattle, and a house that was no longer just solid, but was a home in every way that counted, with the rug from Missouri and the kitchen garden, and the wooden cradle that Henry had outgrown and Thomas would outgrow, and that neither Alice nor Nathan had any intention of putting away. Nathan, in the evenings of those years, had a habit that Alice had catalogued among the things she loved most about him. He would stand at the west-facing window of the front room and watch the light change over the hills with the focused appreciation of a man who has learned not to take good things for granted. She would find him there sometimes, coming in from the day's work, and she would stand beside him and watch the sky change from gold to deep blue to the first stars, and they would talk or they would not talk, and either way was exactly right. He said to her one evening in the autumn of 1885, when the boys were asleep upstairs and the fire was low and the stars were doing their enormous work outside the window, "Do you remember what you said to me in the yard? The day you rode out to me alone," she said. "I said I wanted to build something with you." He said, "You said it was entirely different from every other version of the situation and you wanted me to know you understood the difference." She said, "I still do." He looked at her, those gold-lit eyes that had been one of the first things she noticed, and one of the things she had never stopped noticing. He said, "I think about that a great deal, that you chose it." "That it was real," she said. "It is real. It has been real every day since then." He said, "I know, I am not uncertain about it. I just want to keep noticing it, saying it out loud." She understood this completely. She put her hand against his face and he covered it with his, and she said, "Then keep saying it." He said, "I love you. I have loved you since approximately the afternoon of the gray mare and the new lead rope, which I recognize was embarrassingly early." She said, "I fell in love with you the day you burned the paper." He said, "That is an extremely specific moment." She said, "You burned a legal document on the principle of the thing, on behalf of a woman you barely knew." That is exactly the kind of man I was looking for and had mostly stopped expecting to find. He held her hand against his face for a moment, and she felt him smile, not the almost smile, the real one. He said, "I am very glad I burned it." She said, "So am I." The fire settled in the grate, and the stars went on above the mesa country, and somewhere upstairs Thomas made a sound in his sleep, some small dreaming sound that resolved itself without waking, and the house was quiet and warm and full. And Alice Brenner stood at the west-facing window with her husband's hand over hers and felt, as she had felt on the day by the creek, and on the morning in the unfinished church, and in the January yard, and 100 ordinary evenings before and after all of those. The specific weighted happiness of a life that had been chosen freely, and built honestly, and loved with the full honest presence of two people who had decided together that this was exactly where they meant to be. The land outside was vast and dark and full of the ongoing life of the territory, the stars enormous over the mesas, the creek running quiet in the dark, the horses standing easy in the barn, the cottonwoods along the ridge already holding the silver moonlight, the long red country stretching in every direction under the New Mexico sky. All of it chosen, all of it real, all of it, every last part of it theirs.